Hello, everybody. Welcome to the River Falls Public Library. My name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, but I also want to thank our speakers and the Library Foundation. The Library Foundation supports all of our programs, specifically all of our summer programs and the programs tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about the format tonight, and then we'll get started. So we have an in-person audience, and everybody who's sitting here is thinking, duh, yeah, we have an in-person audience. But we also have a live virtual audience, and this is being recorded for later viewing. So when we get to the Q&A at the end, I will invite people to ask questions. We'll also have an opportunity for our live audience that's watching on Facebook or YouTube to ask questions. Just so everybody is aware of the format tonight. So I want to introduce our authors tonight. Jenny Kalvaitis, I did it right, has a master's degree in public history from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And she has worked in informal education and museum education for over 10 years. We Will Always Be Here, a guide for exploring and understanding LGBTQ+ activism in Wisconsin, is Jenny's first book project. Congratulations. Kristen Whitson has a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she has worked in digital preservation, community and indigenous archives, and LGBTQ+ archives. We Will Always Be Here, a guide for exploring and understanding LGBTQ activism in Wisconsin, is Kristen's first project. Great book, and I'm so excited to hear from you. Okay.
Hello. And so I think we can just ask you to advance our slides for us, right? Oh, I have a clicker. Great. That's Donna Coleman. We're going to talk about her a little bit later. So go ahead.
Beautiful. So thank you so much for inviting us here to share about our book today. Thank you so much to the River Falls Library Foundation and all of you for coming as well. We're very excited to share with you, the story of our book, how it came to being, as well as some of the amazing history that happened here in Wisconsin.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to tell you a little bit about how this book came about and why this source material and why now. And then we're going to dive into some of the sources from the book and talk about each of the chapters in the book. We'll read a little bit from each chapter. After that, we'll talk about where we go from here, and we would love questions at the end. The discussion is some of our favorite parts of this work. So there you go.
So just to start tonight, our book is actually built in a thematic fashion. So we'll kind of go through what our different themes are. But generally as humans, we think in a linear way. So we included this couple of pages that appear in our book to kind of orient ourselves in time and space. So we cover 100 years of history in the book, We Will Always Be Here. And it really starts with the story actually in 1914 with the story of Ralph Cowenio, who was arrested for cross-dressing. And we purposely in our book really focus on moments of activism, of growth, and Ralph's story is one of the few court cases that we are going to talk about or did talk about in our book, specifically because the newspaper interviews were just so affirming in identity. And there was a lot of very powerful statements included in some of that historical record. The reality, though, we start in 1914 in written record, is that people that would identify as part of that LGBTQ community have lived in Wisconsin for as long as people have lived on this land that we know of as Wisconsin. It's just that those early sources are harder to find. So you can see here kind of that time span that we do cover, starting in 1914, going all the way into 2020 with the publication of some books we'll talk about that are the first volumes in this series that our book is a part of as well. And we tell these amazing stories that just follow the same path of U.S. history, including some groundbreaking Wisconsin laws. Like 1967 is the first time that Lloyd Barbie introduces a bill to decriminalize homosexuality in Wisconsin. 1967 is 2 years prior to Stonewall. And even Wisconsin, 1982, is the first state in the nation to pass a non-discrimination law.
Not New York, not California. People are always surprised by that, but it was passed here. How long before the next state passed one?
9 years.
9 years before the next state passed a non-discrimination law for LGBTQ plus people. So like the timeline, we wanted to give readers and teens especially a look at how the LGBTQ plus activism of Wisconsin is spread throughout the state. So we really wanted teens to be able to open up this book, look at this map, and know that there is a history of queer activism near them, somewhere near them. And, you know, there's some places where there's like many counties without a little star, but our hope is that most teens can find themselves in this history.
So the question then is, you know, how did Kristen and I get here? And the reality is that the story actually starts with the gentleman on the screen here on his 2-volume history series. So this image is of Dr. Richard Wagner. He was an amazing politician here in Wisconsin. He was a historian. He had a PhD in history, and he lived a lot of amazing history here. And kind of his gift, his legacy that he left behind is this amazingly rich 2-volume history that when he was raising funds in order to write and publish, there was an uprising, this idea that they wanted an outreach piece for teens especially. And so that's kind of where our origin story starts, is with the original amazing work of Dr. Wagner. He lived actually much of the history that's in his 2nd volume, Coming Out, Moving Forward. He collected throughout Wisconsin throughout his years, and his own collections then were donated to an LGBTQ archive that allowed this history to come to light, and our volume to be published as well. So when they had these funds to come up with this teen outreach piece, the question is, you know, what are we going to do? At the time, I was the coordinator of secondary education for the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they came to me for almost everything teen. So we got to talking about, you know, what this is, and originally the thought it was, maybe we could have a curriculum, you know, as exciting as that sounds. But then the very next thought is, a curriculum on LGBTQ history isn't likely to be widely adopted in the state of Wisconsin. So, you know, what are we going to do? And we really wanted to make sure that we were reaching the teens who needed this content, right? Who needed to understand this history and this story. So we wanted to focus on the history of activism because in my experience, I used to run a program and have volunteered for years with a program called National History Day, where students in middle school and high school choose a topic in history and they get to research it and they get to own it. And every year there are topics on Stonewall, the Well, the Lavender Menace, you know, these topics that students are hungry to know about, but for generations, people have had to fight to learn this history. And we wanted to change that. So we wanted to focus on activism to really get those teens excited for that social justice content that they love. We wanted to make sure that there was teen inclusion in what we were doing. So part of our process was actually, you know, Kristen's amazing background in archives meant that we pulled together this critical mass of sources. And then we had teens tell us which ones were most interesting to them. And so their voices are included in the pages of this book in little thought bubbles like the one you can see on the screen, because we wanted to make sure that this history was relevant to the lives that were being lived in Wisconsin today. And then also, our book is based around what's called primary source analysis, which is best practice in social studies classrooms today. Even though this wasn't written to go directly into schools, we wanted it to be useful in whatever way is possible that could be integrated into a classroom or in an after-school program. So we wanted to make sure we would align with that.
So here's a little flashback to our history classes, and the archivists in the room can't answer this question. Does anybody besides the archivist know what a primary source is? Have you heard of primary sources? Do you know what primary sources are? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Good. Okay, good. The librarians also can't answer. But so we use the book to help teach teens what primary sources are and to sort of walk them through a version of primary source analysis. So this book, We Will Always Be Here, is a primary source reader. And that's essentially a book that points readers, the readers to the original sources and gives them a little bit of context and explanation and tries to connect some dots for them. And as Jenny said, this is something that is happening in social studies classrooms around the state. And so we wanted to underscore what teens are already learning. So a primary source, just for all of us who may not know, is anything that was written at the time of an event, witnessed by a person in the moment, something that's recorded by a primary person. So letters, newspapers, objects, tweets today are primary sources, speeches, diaries, photographs. This sign in this picture on the screen is a sign from the night that the Stonewall Inn was raided in New York City in 1969. That sign is a primary source. And so we include this sign in our book as part of the explanation of primary sources for teens to get a look at what that really means. And then by contrast, our book, a textbook, a research paper, those would all be considered secondary sources.
We also want to note, though, that we recognize not all sources are created equal. There are things that are in the historical record that are untrue, and we really did make sure that we vetted the content that appears in this book to make sure that everything is factual and part of Wisconsin history and tells this important story. This is still me. So each chapter in our book is organized in what we call our spectrum of activism. And I like this illusion because of the reality of spectrums being associated with the LGBTQ movement, but also the idea of a spectrum in that no two forms of activism are the same, just like no two forms of identity. And there's no reason that we need to compare one as better or braver or more important than another. In fact, there are times in our history when the bravest, most courageous thing that you could have done is being true to yourself. And that's absolutely amazing. And we also recognize that sometimes the word activism makes some people nervous, but the reality is that if you tuned in tonight online, if you came here to the library, if you turned on a news story, you are partaking in a form of activism. You are purposefully seeking out information. You are purposefully educating yourself on a topic, which is as important form of activism as any, to become that informed citizenry. So that is kind of the span of our spectrum of activism. And within this book, then, we do kind of categorize different history that happened in that 100 years, 5 to 7 stories per chapter, kind of walking through this spectrum. And Kristen and I will then share with you tonight one story from each of those chapters, and they're kind of these discrete, nicely packaged, contextual stories along with a primary source in each chapter.
So first on our list of types of activism is educating oneself. And I'm going to kind of switch back and forth here between explaining and then reading from the book. So here's how we start this chapter in the book for our teens. What we learn shapes us into the people we become. We are taught by our teachers, families, and friends, but we must also take our education into our own hands and seek out topics that matter to us. And this is especially true of topics that don't normally come up in classrooms or casual conversations. We're trying to inspire teens to learn more, read more, dig more. One way to learn more about LGBTQ plus issues is by reading materials created by local and regional LGBTQ plus groups and organizations. Today, you might try visiting websites or finding groups on social media. In the early 1970s, organizations such as the Gay People's Union or the GPU in Milwaukee printed and distributed their own newspapers, which some groups still do today. Founded by UW-Milwaukee students in 1971, the GPU was an incredibly important LGBTQ plus group in Wisconsin. 5 individuals printed their names on the board of directors list when the GPU's articles of incorporation were filed. Gerald Earl Myers, Michael Mitchell, Eldon Murray, Louis Stymack, and Donna Utke. And the reason I share those with you is because the seemingly simple act of making their names public was courageous because state laws still viewed homosexuality as a criminal offense. That law that bill that Lloyd Barbie brought up in 1967 didn't pass. So homosexuality was still criminal. As this group became official, lawyers tried to charge them more, Banks did not allow them to open accounts, and the federal government refused to recognize them multiple times. The group published the monthly newspaper GPU News for about a decade. The paper was distributed by GPU News members. People were encouraged to pass issues along to friends, and the editors also relied on readers to provide content for their issues. So like so many of the early LGBTQ plus publications, GPU News was a do-it-yourself project and a labor of love. And this is a screenshot from one of the book pages to show you how we put the primary sources onto the page, because we really wanted our teen readers to get a sense for what these looked like in real life and maybe inspire them to like go to an archive and see the stuff in person. So then next up in chapter 2, we talk to readers about telling their own stories. And this also gives us the chance to introduce the idea of oral histories to our readers and to tell them a little bit about different types of archival materials available for their own research. We really love the idea of teaching teens that their stories are important too, and that stories like theirs exist in the historical record. So here's some more from chapter 2. Some stories are spoken aloud rather than being written down. An oral history is typically an interview that is saved as an audio or video recording and shared through an archive. Archives keep papers, materials, recordings, and artifacts so that they can be discovered again and again by students throughout history. The Digital Transgender Archive is entirely online. It links to many oral histories with transgender folks of color, such as Selena Meza, who recorded their interview as part of the Treader Transgender Oral History Project. Selena identifies as a Mexican-American, queer, trans femme, assigned male at birth, and uses both they, them, and she, her pronouns. They're originally from Chicago, Illinois, and moved to rural Nakusa, Wisconsin, when they were around 5 years old. So the Digital Transgender Archive has many recordings of stories like Selena's. So we ask our readers to consider, why is Selena's voice and story important to capture in an oral history? And how could your story add to our understanding of Wisconsin's history? In chapter 3, we talk about being true to oneself. As Jenny said, sometimes being yourself is the bravest thing that you can do. So there's Donna Coleman with her amazing checkered pants on her motorcycle. So here's some from chapter 3. Each one of us brings something unique to this world. Dressing and acting as yourself, having relationships with whomever you choose, pursuing the jobs you want and the passions you love. These are things that make the world a richer place. However, these are freedoms that U.S. law and mainstream society have denied to LGBTQ plus people throughout much of history. Many individuals have been emotionally traumatized and physically harmed simply for being themselves. Yet there are many historical examples of LGBTQ plus folks who found creative and inspiring ways to be true to their identities, even in very challenging situations. So we hope these stories embolden you, the readers, and all of you, to take action by expressing your own identity. Sometimes being true to yourself is the most courageous thing you can do. In the 1970s, gay men and gay women in Wisconsin could belong to the Forker Motorcycle Club in Milwaukee. The club's members chose to call themselves the Forkers, in part because the word suggests something that goes in more than one direction, like a fork in the road. And many of the group's lesbian members felt as though they had taken the path less traveled. Donna Coleman was one of the club's co-founders. She served on the board of directors of the Milwaukee GPU, Gay People's Union, from 1974 to 1978. And as a lifelong Catholic, she was also involved in Milwaukee Dignity, a group offering affirmation and acceptance for LGBTQ plus Catholics. When she moved to Oxford, Wisconsin in the late 1980s, she formed and led the Lizards of Central Wisconsin. This group of lesbians aged 30 and over met monthly to socialize. So the Forker MC Club patch in this image here and below this in the book belonged to Donna Coleman, who donated it to the UW-Madison Archive in 2020. Patches like this are usually sewn onto leather jackets and display aspects of the wearer's personality or identity. The crossed motorcycles on this patch represent the forker part of the club's name. So what other elements of the patch could convey something about the owner's identity is a question we ask the readers.
So our next chapter then is about building community. And what we write is that communities can be big or small, public or private, formal or informal. Throughout Wisconsin history, LGBTQ folks have formed a wide range of communities in order to protect, educate, and support one another. One of the stories in this chapter that we share then is that of Ted Pierce. He was born in Chicago in 1907 and moved to Madison at the age of 3 with his family. His paternal grandparents were born into slavery, and he attended UW-Madison, worked as a tailor, and then also served as the executive office messenger for 3 different Wisconsin governors. Ted was always known for his unique sense of style. When he was in high school at East High School in Madison, he earned the nickname "our fashion plate," which was a common phrase at the time to describe someone who dressed fashionably. LGBTQ people were not openly accepted in American society during the 1940s and 50s. Many individuals in Wisconsin were arrested for what they called homosexual rings at the time. Yet in Madison, Pierce was able to create a space for gay men to gather that he described as a magic group centered on the 700 block of Jennifer Street. The members of the magic group were known to have a refined taste. They dressed stylishly, they enjoyed fancy food and drink, and had cultured discussions about politics and art. As an African-American gay man in the early 20th century, Pierce cared about building a community where people like him could feel safe and free to be themselves. In addition to maintaining the magic group, he also kept up an amazing network of long-distance letter writing with friends. One of his longest-running correspondences was with Willard Motley, an African-American writer who met Pierce on the Capitol Square in Madison, just near his tailor shop. The two of them continued to write to each other for 27 years. Motley's letter is pictured here on the screen, and it was sent to Pierce from Mexico, where he was living at the time. And one of the things that I love to share is how Motley closes this letter, because you can tell he's a writer and you can tell that they had this amazing friendship. And what he wrote was, "And after you read my letter, look at Madison for me, at the campus, at the lake, at the beautiful things there, and remember that a part of me lives there in Madison with you. As ever, Wilmot." Even in the 1940s and 50s, Pierce built communities in his own backyard and across the globe. And one of the things that I always love about his letters is he also is constantly apologizing for his late response, which I think is something that a lot of us still do today. And then finally, our last chapter is that people, have to eventually really get active. And the amazing thing about getting active is it's really about using often political systems that are in place. There are multiple ways that you can get active in supporting or opposing issues, and that's what this chapter is all about, examples led by the LGBTQ community here. And for example, the story that we'll share tonight is that of Jamie Nabozny, who grew up in Ashland and came out as a gay teenager at the age of 13. Starting in 1988, when he was in 7th grade, and continuing into high school, he was bullied for his sexual orientation. The high school principal sided with the bullies. She dismissed their behavior, saying that boys will be boys. The harassment continued until 1992, when Nabozny ran away to Minneapolis. He eventually earned his high school diploma and was admitted to the University of Minnesota. In 1995, Nabozny filed a lawsuit against his former school district and several of the school officials for failing to protect his 14th Amendment rights. His lawyers argued that Nabozny was being discriminated against because he belonged to a minority group as a gay teen. The lawsuit traveled through the court systems, and Nabozny was ultimately paid $900,000 in damages. 3 school district administrators were ordered to pay this amount, and the school district was found not guilty. But Navazny's case helped to give young people across the nation more protections under the law. This lawsuit helped clarify the role of schools in bullying motivated by gender and sexual orientation. A federal law called Title IX, which protects people from sex-based discrimination in education programs and government-funded activities, was amended just a couple years later, with the Navazny case cited as precedent. The change required all U.S. schools to provide a harassment-free environment to gay and lesbian students. Thanks in part to Jamie Navazny's actions, kids who are bullied in schools today can feel protected under the law and less alone. Navazny used the government systems that were in place and are meant as a check and a balance to get active and protect his own rights, as well as help set a precedent for other students who get bullied.
So, as we talked about, activism takes a number of different forms and spans a spectrum of ways of making change. The LGBTQ plus people, allies, and activists we read about in this book make change by educating themselves, by telling their own stories, by being true to themselves, by building communities, and by getting active. These people have made their own contributions to a larger movement. And over the decades, their efforts have added up to significant changes in Wisconsin and around the nation. Today, same-sex marriage is legal in Wisconsin and around the United States. Legal protections in housing, jobs, restaurants, and businesses for LGBTQ plus people are much more common than they were 50 years ago. And in fact, attitudes about gay rights have changed faster than attitudes about almost any other social issue in the history of the United States. But unfortunately, attacks on gay people and transgender teens in particular are ramping up again around the country. And our hope is that this study of Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history reminds us where we've already been, because a little historical perspective can give us hope for a better future. Our goal with this book was to educate teens on Wisconsin's unique LGBTQ plus history, the good and the bad. We wanted teens to see how Wisconsin was at the forefront of gay rights history when we passed that first non-discrimination law in 1982. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ plus people have existed here going back to the Two-Spirit people among the Ho-Chunk, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ plus people have always been here and always will be.
And the great news is that our youth are hungry for this knowledge. They are powerful and they are resilient. So this book is really meant to be a celebration of their identities and give them a knowledge of the history that they continue to write today. The historical record of LGBTQ activism generally starts with court cases as the predominant sources. And we are seeing court cases and legislation once again. And each generation continues to fight new battles in the same war for equality. But we are excited to work with the youth as we travel across Wisconsin, as we go into different communities. It is clear that our youth and all of us will always be here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stand in front of the camera just for a second so people don't think that there's a voice coming from some strange location when they're looking online. I just want to give everybody an opportunity to ask some questions. We will start with our in-person audience and then we can move to our virtual audience. Is there anybody here who's got a question for our speakers?
You mentioned that Wisconsin was the first state to pass a LGBT law. What was the second state? I'm hoping Minnesota, because that's where I'm from.
That's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked us that.
Look it up. I know it was 9 years later.
There's a great, I know it's like history teachers can be like, don't look at Wikipedia, but there's a great Wikipedia timeline of LGBTQ plus history and events in our country. So if you find that, I want to say it was like, it might have been California.
I think so.
Okay, while we're waiting for a possible answer to that question.
Which is a
there-
great question.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions in the audience?
a long way.
Do you know if there's a movement to align this to like a standard in the Wisconsin state standard for like as far as content, so it has to be taught?
You answer that. I'll get her the
Yes.
thing.
Oh, okay. So, in Wisconsin, social studies standards are under local control. So there's a very little content that is actually mandated by the state. There's Act 31, which mandates Indigenous history being taught in the classroom. And recently there was a law passed for Holocaust history, but that's the only content that I know that is mandated. But the book is aligned to standards. So there's different local school boards that can adopt it, but very little in Wisconsin is actually tied to content with the standards. Our book is fully aligned with those standards. A lot of the standards are about doing the work of historians and thinking like a historian, which is a learning theory that the Wisconsin Historical Society also published and is embedded throughout our book. So if that bill was ever to come, or if a local school district would ever want to adopt this as part of their curriculum, it is aligned to go in and be a best practices kind of book that would allow teachers to interpret with their students and do the work of being a historian with that primary source in the context. Great question. Thank you. Maybe one day.
I have something to share, which is this is part of some of the other materials that we have put together for folks. So we can talk about some of these other things a little bit more. But the thing I want to point out is that because we want to make teachers' jobs easier, we put together this educational resource guide. It's not a curriculum, but it does go through each chapter with some critical thinking questions, vocabulary, discussion questions, reflection questions, and even some assignments. We kind of envision this being used in like GSA clubs or GSAFE clubs, but it also would be great for a National History Day project or any teacher who wanted to include this in their curriculum. We also did a presentation at the Wisconsin State Reading Association in February, where we specifically called out the standards that our book is aligned to. So if that's something you're interested in, we can get that to you. Did you find the answer?
I didn't find what was number 2, but I thought with Minnesota, this would make you happy. Minnesota became the first state to ban employment discrimination based on both sexual orientation and gender identity when it passed a Human Rights Act in 1993. So a different kind of a first still. So some good, some good support there.
That was a great question. Thank you. Are there any other questions in the audience?
Where in Wisconsin is the most like GLBT archive material, primary sources?
Well, they exist in all archives. So I bet is there LGBTQ plus material in the UW River Falls archive? Yep. So there are those kinds of archival materials everywhere, but there's particularly large collections at UW Milwaukee. They have a huge LGBTQ plus collection. UW Madison has a collection that is focused on Dane County. UW Milwaukee's is really more statewide. And then at UW Green Bay, there's a great oral history collection of LGBTQ plus folks. But really, this history exists everywhere. And so because it was lived everywhere, there is documentation of it everywhere, even if it takes some digging to get to.
And just to add, actually, we did a talk just yesterday for Door County, where Kristen talked a lot about like how you find those sources. So if it's something you're interested in, she can definitely talk more about that too, because it can be a hunting job.
You mentioned Nicholas Treader, so I was looking at you with them, and then I thought, one in we're in Wisconsin.
Yep.
So just to put in a plug for UWRF, they also have a Gender and Sexuality Alliance and a Pride Center. So I know there's resources there. And I beg your pardon, I don't know a lot about it, but I think there's a parent group called PFLAG.
PFLAG stands for Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays.
Okay.
And it's bigger than just lesbians and gays at this point. But yeah.
So I know we have a Facebook group in the River Falls and another group called Out in the Valley. So there are some other support groups and resources in that way. Are there other questions?
So I'm involved with a scholarship that is for LGBTQ plus students in Northwestern Wisconsin. And I'm in contact with, getting in contact with a lot of like the GSAs
Mhm.
in like Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls
Mhm.
area. And I'm trying to like kind of bring it this way too. So you said that you kind of envision this as something maybe that can be available at GSAs and other type of clubs like that. How can I help make that more
Oh.
available to people?
That would be amazing. First of all, we love talking to teenagers. Like, we love talking to you guys, but talking to a room full of teenagers, if you work with teenagers, you know, they're weird and they're fierce and they're wonderful and they always make me cry because they're so great. So really it can take a lot of different forms. We could come talk to a GSA club. There could be a book club for them where they read parts of the book every week for 2 months, and then we come talk to them. You could use this educational resource guide to guide that. We're super open to however that takes shape. Oh, here's another
Traveling
one. Yes. So do you want to talk about the traveling?
Oh, sure. So actually just launching and like June 9th, so just a couple weeks old, is a traveling exhibit based on the content in this book as well. And just an amazing kind of graphic novel style artistry as well, done by an Indigenous artist by the name of Nipanette Lansome. And you can see over here, we have kind of that banner running along the screen. That is the imagery, and we've got some bookmarks there with additional information. So you can even check that out and share that as well. But we do work with a number of kind of kids organizations like that. We have Evansville teenagers right now reading the book, and we go by them next week. So we love doing that kind of thing, but also, get in touch with us and we can see what we can do to get reduced funds on books or different things like that, because our goal is really to get these books in the hands of those teens. So
Awesome. Thanks.
thank you for the work you do.
Do we have any more questions in our in-person audience? I can come back to if somebody thinks of something. Yeah, please.
There's a book in Minnesota about the lesbian back to the land movement in the 1970s.
I'm one of those. No, I mean, I'm a
modern
land
version.
lesbian. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you see much about that doe farm in Wisconsin, Daughters of the Earth?
That's in the book.
It is in the book. Yep. Yeah. So we talk about the Women's Land Cooperative, and we compare and contrast it with another cooperative called Lysistrata, which was a feminist cooperative in Madison, and they ran a restaurant and a bar. And so so it's in the book. What else did you want to know about it? I'm a lesbian who lives on the land with my wife, so that's why she's laughing at me. We just put up the beehives this weekend.
As far as I understand, Daughters of the Earth doe is still in existence. So I've been needing to get there.
Yeah.
Have you been there?
I have not. I haven't. No. From what I understand, they made a decision at some point to exclude transgender women from their work. And so it's something we talk about in the book because we think it's important for teens to know about it. Personally, that's not a view that I support, so I probably would not go visit them. But that doesn't mean they're not an important part of history as well.
So, Kim, do we have any questions online? Nope. Okay, so I have a question.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to allow my ignorance to
It's okay.
just happen. So you explained what it means to be an activist. What does it mean to be an ally?
Do you want me to take it?
Sure.
Okay.
Although okay, you say that, but can I go
Yeah,
first?
totally.
Okay. Because I work with one of the best allies I've ever known or gotten to work with, because she does stuff exactly just like that. Like, whenever she thinks that there is something that might be emotionally difficult, emotional labor, that is something that she feels like is her job as an ally to jump in and sort of like put herself in between me and whatever's difficult. She totally does that. So this wasn't a difficult question, but she does that all the time. And that's a great example of what it is to be an ally, I think. Do you want to talk about that some more?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I am an ally. I was originally assigned to write this book. And I knew that as an ally, I would do a terrible job if I was going to write this book alone. So I had known Kristen and worked with her before. And then I ran into her at a conference and she was talking about how she was working in an LGBTQ archive. And I was like, whoa. Like, I think that this could be a beautiful partnership. So I see, my role as an ally as one understanding that I don't know everything. I can't know everything. I can listen to everybody in the world, but there's no way that I can actually understand what it means to live and breathe in that world. And recognize that there are times when I shouldn't talk. And that even though I am a historian who has studied these things, I in fact know less than a lot of other people because I haven't lived it. So I think that being a good ally means listening first. It means recognizing where you belong and where you don't belong and when your voice is less important. And there are times when Kristen is this amazing warrior and the best thing that I can do is stand behind her and support. And there are times when things got hard and they have gotten hard on a road when I ask, should I take that emotional labor on? Because it can get hard to keep speaking. And as an ally, I have a number of privileges that mean that I can continue to speak loudly and clearly when it's hard. So I think that a lot of those factors go into being a good ally, a strong ally, but understanding that it is a continual growth process. So I appreciate the compliments, but it's a working battle.
So forgive the librarian in me.
It's okay.
So
Nothing else.
is an ally also an activist, but an activist not necessarily an ally? And it sounds to me like you're saying an ally is a more emotional support, but that's not the way I've understood it. So I'm trying to comprehend that.
Yeah, I think there are ways that activists aren't always allies. I think a good ally is always an activist because it moves along that spectrum, right, of educating yourself first. There can be some activists who are a little bit like bulls in china shops. And they enjoy speaking for other people and they love a good cause and they'll march for everything. I see snickers, but it's true, right? We can kind of imagine some of these people that we know in our lives that are like this, and they can be fabulous people. But to be a true ally, I think you also have to understand that you're not always the best person to be that bull in the china shop, that there are times when it is not about you. And to recognize that is in fact the case makes you more of an ally activist than just an activist.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me understand that. So I have a difficult question. So I'm wondering if you can help the audience understand the implications of the potential Supreme Court decision to possibly overturn Roe v. Wade. How is that decision potentially impact the LGBTQ community?
That's a very good question. So we talked about this a little bit before, so I appreciate the heads up so I could prepare my answer a little bit. But and I would love to hear how you all are feeling about this too. As a queer woman, I've been seeing this coming for a long time. The right to an abortion rests on the right to privacy, and the right to privacy is what's in the Constitution. It's in the 14th Amendment, I think. Is that right? You know the Constitution better than I do. And so the Supreme Court previously has said not that they think abortion is okay. They have said that they think that the Supreme Court, the federal government, no government has a right to tell somebody what to do with their own body. So if that right is overturned, there are a whole bunch of rights that we will potentially, I think probably fall right behind it. The first is gay marriage. I don't want to scare people, but I anticipate that gay marriage is going to be overturned within 18 months, would be my guess. That's what I'm planning for. That's what my wife and I are planning for. After that comes the right to birth control, the right to same-sex sexual activity, the right for women to have their own bank accounts and credit cards. And I don't mean to be an alarmist. These are things that legal scholars have analyzed extensively. And it is clear that if this Supreme Court and this movement continues, that that's the direction that they're going. The leaked Supreme Court opinion that came out, 6 weeks ago or whenever that was, somebody said, I think Alito said in there, we don't mean for this judgment to apply to anything else like gay marriage. I just don't believe that to be true. I don't believe that to be true. So not having a right to privacy means not having a right to transition one's gender or to have gender affirming medical or psychological therapeutic care. There's a whole bunch of things that stand to fall right behind it. And it's really disappointing. It's really disappointing. I can end with something hopeful, but I don't want to sugarcoat it either.
I'm up for hopeful.
Here's something that Jenny reminds me of often, especially because she has studied history more than I have. I study a lot of how information is organized and how you find it, but she studies the actual history more than I do. And that progress goes in waves. We fought this battle once before. We can fight it again. One of the people we talk about in our book is Judy Greenspan, and they now use they, them pronouns, and they were an activist in Madison in the early 1970s. They were among the first people in the country to run for public office in 1972. They ran for the Madison School Board, predated Harvey Milk by several years. They lost the battle. They lost the school board race, totally anticipated that they would, but they got like a third of the vote. They got like 30% of the vote. And Judy knew that they were going to lose, but they felt it was really important to do it anyways. And now, here all these decades later, we're still talking about their example. Jenny and I got a chance to hear them speak a few months ago, and they said, I didn't think we were going to be here again. They said, this battle is really for transgender teens that we're fighting right now. They said, I didn't think we would be here again, but we fought this battle once before, and we can do it again. So we will.
Of Tammy Baldwin as an out lesbian senator in Wisconsin. How'd she do that? Oh, can anyone here give me any information about how Senator Tammy Baldwin has been so successful as an out lesbian senator in this conservative state?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one thing to know is that the state isn't that conservative. The state is what I might call purple. There are big red swaths of conservative people spread further apart. And then there are lots of blue spots in the cities. And so our state is not definitively liberal or conservative. It feels like that in pockets. If you're in Madison, it feels like everybody in the whole world is liberal. But, there are liberals who drive Priuses who don't really understand the problem with gas prices. So, anyways, that's not the point. So the first thing is, I don't think we're just a conservative or just a liberal state. We're just a state full of people. The second thing is that Tammy Baldwin has been doing this work and political work for a very long time, pretty much since the minute she graduated from law school. She also had a great mentor in Dr. Dick Wagner, who wrote the first 2 books in these series. He was the first, I can't remember if he was the first or the second out person on the Dane County Board of Supervisors. And the Dane County Board of Supervisors has served as a pretty good launching pad for national politicians. So Mark Pocan served on the Dane County Board of Supervisors. He's our representative in the Madison area. Who else was on? Oh, I think Steve Gunderson was on there. Jim Yaden was on there, who are all like openly gay activists. So she cut her political teeth like at a very local level and then worked her way up. I would also say I am not a political expert, but my experience of Tammy is just that like she's a really rational, reasonable, logical person to talk to for anybody who's talking to her. She is certainly not like a far left progressive by any stretch of the imagination. I think she does a pretty good job connecting to all different kinds of folks around Wisconsin. And there is a pretty good, I could speak to this personally too. There's a interesting perspective in rural Wisconsin of acceptance of LGBTQ plus people. You might not think that, but I have experienced it. This is not across the board. It is not a generalization. But I have seen it and experienced it and read about it. There are several books about it. There tends to be this attitude of just like, okay, well, we'll help you on your farm if you come over and help us on our farm, and then we're just not going to talk about it, which is not great and is not awful. So I don't know. That may have had something to do with it too. We were just
The question
talking
is,
about that.
do we have the Wagner books in this library? And I'm remiss because when I read this book, I did see those references and I did not check to see if we have them, but I'm going to make sure that we do. Okay.
One other thing I just wanted to add about Tammy Baldwin is she is on the cover of our book in a fabulous pink triangle sweater.
A very young Tammy Baldwin.
A very young Tammy Baldwin. I think 1993. So the image is from?
1993.
Yeah.
So unless somebody else has a question, I have one closing question and then I have some closing remarks. So this is an incredible piece of work and I thought it was fascinating. So my question is, what does your future hold as authors? Do you plan to keep writing or go a different direction?
So we're not entirely sure, right? But I do have a really good friend in Texas who is an archivist, who has connections, and also was very kind and very sweet in what he was saying about our book. And he wants to do one in Texas. So we just started having conversations, and we know that Texas could use a book like this as well. So maybe something like that will be coming down the pipeline. But then I don't know. Who knows?
Documentary.
Thank you, though. Yeah. Oh, documentary.
Yeah. So PBS Wisconsin is putting together a 2-hour documentary on Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history based on all three of these books and other LGBTQ plus history. Also, they needed an image research coordinator, so I might be doing that a few hours a week, but it'll be coming out next year, and it's fantastic. I've seen the first hour of it, and I just cried all the way through it. It's an amazing thing to see our history on a screen like that. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. So I think we're just going to keep doing stuff like that, and we're really into the book talks. We love doing stuff like this and working with teens, so we're just going to keep doing this as long as we can.
So you answered a question that I actually had not asked, but I was interested in knowing if any other states had anything similar. But that's interesting that may be some future work for you both too. So thank you, Jenny and Kristen, for being your authentic selves with us tonight. Thank you for contributing to the LGBT community and everybody who loves them to help us understand. So I want to thank the audience here for coming tonight too. It means a lot that you're here. And I want to thank the people who are watching virtually and also the people who watch this recording later on. I want to remind everybody that we have a brainstorming event coming up here at the library on Thursday, June 28th to reimagine spaces here in the library. So we have a beautiful physical library, but if you're upstairs, you'll notice the paint and the carpet and the furniture is getting a little old. We have some things we want to reconsider in terms of moving some spaces around while we're looking at a potential remodel. So we're reaching out to the community with a brainstorming event on Thursday, June 28th at, is it 6:30, Kim? Oh, 6:30 p.m. down here in the lower level. And we will look to have future programs like this another day. Thanks, everybody. Good night.